Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Death Metal, and we're almost done. This is the second to the last part. I guess it's actually a 7-issue series instead of 6 issues. Honestly, I don't really even check online to see what the reading issues are for Death Metal anymore. I just kind of letting it go and just seeing how far we get into it. But I'm pretty sure we have one more part left. But here's the thing. So in the last video that we did, the last part of the story, we had this scenario where we basically saw the superheroes on Earth pretty much eradicating Earth, right? Just eliminating the entirety of Earth itself, right? The Earth's populace, all that kind of stuff. And the reason why, and I think this is something that was a little bit murky in the last video that we did, so we're going to try to clarify here. The reason why is because in DC Comics, this is called Prime Earth, right? It's the main Earth of DC Comics, the main universe. And the entirety of the Dark Multiverse is based off the main universe. I mean, I guess to a degree, it does involve alien races out there, but for the most part, DC hasn't really specified that. Instead, the entirety of the Dark Multiverse seems to hinge on the entirety of everything going on in the main DC multiverse, the main DC Prime Earth, because of the fact that whenever you look at the Dark Multiverse, you don't really see like dark versions of like the Red Lanterns from like, you know, some cast off planet somewhere, Ismal. You don't really see like a dark version of the Guardians of the Universe from like Maltus, or I guess really Oa as it's called now. You don't really see that. Instead, it's all just dark versions of Earth-based characters and dark versions of Earth. So it stands to reason that if the heroes wanted to mitigate the power of Batman Who Laughs, that they would basically essentially wipe out the Earth's population, because with billions and billions of people come billions and billions and even countless trillions of possibilities. Now, even then, it does require us to sort of cook the books a little bit, right? Because one of the things that we know whenever it comes to branch universe theory and the idea of opposite multiverses, things like that, is that for every possibility, there's an infinite number of other possibilities, and it literally just branches out to infinity. So as long as there's one superhero here, there's an infinite number of possible versions of that superhero in the Dark Multiverse. Every conceivable fear that Superman could have, and even the fears he doesn't even know he has, right? The fears on a subconscious level exist out there in the Dark Multiverse, right? So it's really kind of Scott Snyder and DC taking the infinite possibilities of dark versions of characters and kind of reeling it in and saying there's only so many dark versions of characters that we know of, right? So it's kind of taking what is in effect an infinite number of possibilities and just artificially condensing them down for the sake of telling a story, right? And so because of that, the only real life that's left here on Earth are basically the superheroes that you see here, right? And that's essentially it. There really isn't anything else. Now, the other thing that we saw is that you saw all these different versions of dark worlds that have been created by the Batman Who Laughs showing up on Earth, right? Or at least, you know, coming towards Earth. And so one of the big guesses they make here is perhaps there are no other forms of life out there, right? Because they basically prematurely cut off the power of the Batman Who Laughs from all the crisis energy that existed out there and his ability to create a whole host of new worlds. So long as Perpetua has that power, the Batman Who Laughs does not. And so he has a huge amount of power in the form of Dr. Manhattan, but the ability to create different universes out there doesn't necessarily exist, right? His ability to do that has effectively been cut off. And that's why the superheroes kind of guess and they say, okay, with all the different, you know, dark versions of ourselves that we see here, maybe this is it, right? This is all the Batman Who Laughs has, that there is nothing else there. Once these guys are done, then we basically win, right? And that's why they kind of pull out all the stops and say, okay, then let's get to it. If the likelihood existed that there were other versions of these dark heroes on Earth, right? So they fight this army here. When they beat this army, another army shows up. When they beat that army, another army shows up. If we saw that it was going to basically be a war of attrition, then the superheroes would stage their power out accordingly, right? They would use just enough ability to destroy these heroes and then kind of make sure they don't exhaust themselves, right? Nobody wants to have the rope-a-dope technique done on them, right? When Muhammad Ali beat George Foreman by letting George Foreman pound on him and tire himself out, right? And then go in for the kill on George Foreman. The superheroes don't want to have that happen to them, where they go ham on all these different, you know, this army here, and then have nothing left for all the different other villains that show up or other twisted versions of themselves that show up from across the Dark Multiverse. The other part of that is we actually switch over to Wonder Woman and Lobo. Now, if you guys recall, with Wonder Woman and Lobo, they're traveling to basically the World Forge, right? The idea of trying to find some way to essentially tap into all the anti-crisis energy that exists out there to kind of become the antithesis of the Batman Who Laughs, right? If the Batman Who Laughs and Perpetua are tying into the energy that's created from crisis worlds that they made, right? So the events of of Crisis on Infinite Earths, Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, and those worlds exist because of the actual events that took place, right? So the Dark Multiverse counterpart is the version of Crisis on Infinite Earths or the Anti-Monitor 1. But that Dark Multiverse counterpart only exists because the Crisis on Infinite Earths event happened. If Batman Who Laughs and Perpetua are tapping into that, Dark Crisis power, then what it means is Wonder Woman could in turn tap into the Anti-Crisis energy, right? The idea of the Anti-Monitor not winning, right? That kind of a thing. They can kind of tap into those energies. If that's the case, then what you should be seeing here in this space that they're in, where it's pitch black, are all the hopes and fears and possibilities, right? Because what they're traveling through is basically a tunnel, right? So imagine that like you're driving through some tunnel to get to some location. All the cars that would be around you represent all the fears and the hopes and things like that of all the various humans that exist on Earth. Because of the fact that all the humans are basically gone, there's only a handful of superheroes left, and that crisis energy has effectively been cut off. There's nothing here. And the only real last terror that exists out there, the only real horrifying concept that exists, is now basically the Batman Who Laughs, right? And that's kind of represented by the fact that all the versions of the twisted versions of Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman that all existed that are currently on the battlefield seem to have basically resided here at some point in time, right? Where they've all been pulled out and they're sent to that location. But because the Batman Who Laughs is the only real terror that's left, then it's all the fears that concern the Batman Who Laughs, the forms he could take, different things like that. Now, they're not given a tangible form yet, right? Because right now they're just fears that exist. It seems like it's not until these fears manifest in the physical world that they suddenly take on a form. These twisted versions are things like the Batman Who Laughs is actually the Superman Who Laughs, or it's the Wonder Woman Who Laughs, or the Spectre Who Laughs, or something like that. And it's just a concept. Once this concept leaves this, ethereal plane and it goes to a place like Earth Prime in the DC comics, then it turns into the physical form of the Spectre Who Laughs, or something like that, right? So it's just, at the moment, it's just thoughts that can actually attack them. But for the most part, the other thing that goes on here is the actual confrontation between the Batman Who Laughs and Perpetua. Remember, they're still fighting over dominance of the universe. Now, Perpetua kind of plays this gambit where she's like, look, you have to understand here, I'm the only thing that's holding back those, ethereal powers out there from realizing what we've done, right? And that's one of the things that Scott Snyder kind of hit on here. And this is one of the things that also applies to Marvel Comics, right? That Perpetua is in effect a kind of stand-in for like the One Above All, if not like a step above that in Marvel Comics, right? So in Marvel, you've got the One Above All, and then you have like whatever's above it, right? If there even is anything. Marvel's never said there is, but if there could possibly be a thing above it, then those seem to be the individuals that created Perpetua as well. Because what DC's told us here is that these individuals that created Perpetua and basically sent her on the mission to create the multiverse, they're the ones who run the Omniverse. And the Omniverse is basically a collection of multiverses. And so the Omniverse encases Marvel Comics and encases, Spawn Comics and different things like that. And so, if we extrapolate this out, and we're really delving into the realm of hearsay and just guesswork at this point, but if we extrapolate that out, then we can largely make a reasonable assumption that these omniversal entities that exist out there that created Perpetua seemingly also created the Presence in DC Comics. They created the One Above All in Marvel Comics, right? Like they're the ones that are responsible for seemingly the existence of all things that are out there. Now, DC really seems to be playing it pretty fast and loose with that, and basically kind of, and not even really fast and loose, more kind of hardline, and saying they're only responsible for the creation of DC, right? So seemingly these omniversal forces that are out there basically represent like the writers and artists that create DC Comics. That really seems to be the actual explanation DC is giving us. But if we move away from that actual explanation and we kind of replace it with our own explanation, then they're basically the ones that created everything in existence across every form of media ever, right? Television, movies, comics, actual novels, different things like that. The one thing we do know is that Perpetua was not supposed to do any of this stuff. She was basically sent there for a task. She deviated from her task, and now she's basically gone awry. And so her being able to kind of block the actions of what she's done and the multiverse as it exists from the eyes of these omniversal forces that live out there is really kind of her saying, if you kill me, they're going to become aware of what we've done and what I've done, and they're going to wipe us all out, and they're going to start all over again, right? They're effectively going to reboot, as we call it. And so the Batman Who Laughs is kind of like, so who cares? And so going on the attack again against Perpetua, ultimately he ends up basically destroying her, right? He destroys Perpetua and actually encases her back in the source wall and then siphons off the rest of her power, right? So he now has 100% of all this power across the multiverse. But the saving grace from all this really comes from Wonder Woman, right? Where the book that she has in her possession is the one that would allow her to basically kind of tap into all this anti-crisis energy and then use it for her own purposes, where her and Lobo are basically cornered. Then ultimately Lobo kind of sacrifices himself and says like, I will stay here with these copies of myself and I will basically fight off this Batman Who Laughs as much as I can. Get out of here, right? Like I will be the distraction. Get out of here as fast as you you can and basically save the day. The problem with this is that she loses the journal in the process. One of the Batman Who Laugh forces basically gets a hold of it, and Lobo essentially sacrifices himself. And so when she shows up to the Forge of Worlds, then what this leads to is basically this kind of formation of Darkseid, who says like, all is basically lost here. There's nothing you can do, right? In this moment right now, what few hopes and fears exist out there, or really what few hopes exist out there, come from your superhero friends on Earth, but there's not really anybody left, right? So there's no real hopes here, right? So the possibility of new alternate realities being created based on the positive hopes of people who exist out there is basically null and void, right? It doesn't really exist. This forge is dwindling out, and when it totally burns out, it'll be because all your friends died. And then from there, no new life will be created. It'll allow the Batman Who Laughs to wipe all this away and then basically replace it with his depiction of how life should be, kind of like a dark multiverse 2.0 basically. And so with that in mind, Wonder Woman kind of starts pondering all this, right? And kind of starts thinking about all this. Now the funny thing is, once Batman Who Laughs overtakes Perpetua, he kind of starts to reel back his forces. And when they all basically stop fighting, that's when the superheroes make the false assumption that they won. All the supervillains, all these dark twisted versions kind of stop, and it's like, okay, we won, right? We drove them back, we demoralized them, right? We basically saved the day. And that's when Batman kind of hits on the idea, something's wrong here, right? Like something's wrong, like things are changing, right? Things are shifting. And that's when even Jarro and almost anybody else who can subtly pick up on this starts to realize the Earth is shifting, right? Like the Earth is shifting, it's adjusting, it's modifying. We didn't beat anybody, we've lost, right? The Batman Who Laughs took over Perpetua, she's gone now. He has absolute power across the multiverse. He is in effect God now. There's nothing we can really do to stop him. But Wonder Woman kind of starts to realize this thing, right? She starts to realize as she ponders this idea, she starts to realize what the journal had basically told her, that this machine, quote unquote, kind of a loose term, this machine could be used to make everybody remember all of history, right? To unite everybody in a single mindset of we're all part of this massive tapestry. Now the question is, what does this mean, right? What are the consequences of Wonder Woman taking this revelation that they're all part of a massive tapestry and kind of focusing it into the lasso and then dipping it down into the World Forge? What's the importance of that? Okay, so here's what this means, right? Here's why this is so significant. So let's wind the clock back to Action Comics #1 in 1938. That was the very first appearance of Superman in DC Comics. Because of the popularity of Superman, you saw a whole bunch of other superheroes being introduced. But in DC Comics, it wasn't until Batman and Superman first crossed over that they had a shared universe. But in the aftermath of that shared universe, suddenly it was all these superheroes that exist out there all live on the same Earth, and they all fight various criminals, and they can all team up at any point in time. Now, in 1956, DC introduced Barry Allen. They basically got rid of Wally West, they replaced him with Barry, but they never offered an explanation as to what happened to Jay Garrick. And so DC fixed this in 1961, I think, with the Flash of Two Worlds storyline. And what this did is it basically said any superheroes that you saw out there in DC Comics that were fighting between like 1938 and 1955 or so, they were all basically from a place called Earth 2. All the superheroes that you see now with like Barry Allen going forward, that's all Earth 1. They introduced the multiverse for the very, very first time. Now, this became very chaotic and it became very hectic. And so in 1985, 86, 87, DC basically rebooted with the original Crisis on Infinite Earths event. Now, in the aftermath of the Crisis event, you got rid of the multiverse and you only had one universe, right? That was the end of it. It was just simply a place called New Earth. And so in that universe, a lot of the heroes got new origin stories. They got new tales, right? New adventures, different things like that. And that ran all the way up until we got to the New 52, right? The Flashpoint event, which rebooted yet again. Between those two stories, we got events like 0 Hour, Crisis in Time, where the universe was kind of blinked out and then blinked back into existence again. We got Infinite Crisis, which brought back the multiverse, and then you got Final Crisis, which made the heroes aware of the fact that the multiverse had returned. But after each one of these crisis events, new stories were written, new origin stories were given, and so what's really kind of happening here is DC's basically telling us, and really Scott Snyder's telling us, after the events of the Crisis on Infinite Earths story, nobody remembers anything from before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, right? Nobody recalls that. In the aftermath of Infinite Crisis, nobody really seems to remember the events from before Infinite Crisis. In the aftermath of the events of Flashpoint, nobody really seems to remember anything from before the events of Flashpoint. And then when it comes to smaller stories like 0 Hour and Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, that the heroes who were changed as a result of those stories don't really remember anything that came before it, right? So it's kind of this hodgepodge, sort of organized chaos among all these different heroes in terms of what parts of their history they remember, what parts they don't, right? It's just kind of a patchwork, just gaps in their brains of things that just have or have not happened. What's going on here is Scott Snyder's basically clean slating everything. And he's saying, okay, so what if after the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, heroes remembered life before the events of the crisis, right? They remembered like what life was like before then. They remember their origin stories, all that kind of stuff, and then they remember fighting during the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and they remember the singular universe that came after. And what if, you know, in the aftermath of the events of Flashpoint, they remembered everything that came before Flashpoint? They remember all their history and all that kind of stuff. And so instead of basically treating these stories like reboots, where the characters were totally reworked, they treat them like events, right? Like it's no different than like, you know, some Batman versus Superman story where like they fought for a little while and then they kind of go back to doing what they were doing. They recall doing that. They recall all that stuff. So it's basically DC saying none of the reboots ever happened, right? I mean, I guess they did, but like nobody forgot anything. They remember everything, right? They remember everything that ever happened. Superman remembers his life when his comics were being published back in the 1950s, right? Superman remembers dying. Batman remembers having his back broken by Bane in the original Bane, you know, was it Nightfall storyline? You know, these are all now in continuity. And so there is no such thing in DC Comics now of that story is not in continuity. The only exception to that are the Elseworld stories. But like in terms of everything that's ever been published in DC Comics, it all happened now, right? It all actually took place, right? There's no more differentiating between the publishing of DC before Crisis and after Crisis. That doesn't exist anymore. It's all in continuity stuff. That's basically what this means. That's why it's huge. It's a massive moment, right? It's one of the biggest things. And so with all that being said, Wonder Woman is now completely powered by all this anti-crisis energy and comes emerging out with the intention of facing off against the Batman who laughs. More so than that, because of the fact that all the heroes remember all their history now, they're unified in a way that they don't recall, because all the previous adventures that they had together they forgot about, they now remember, which makes them even closer. They're more tight-knit than they were before because they know the sacrifices, the heroes that were lost that are still gone. Like all that stuff is a huge, great big thing now. So this is awesome. It's colossal. It's why I told you guys, this is basically kind of like a reboot slash not reboot, right? This is DC's version of Secret Wars from 2015 with Marvel Comics. It's what it feels like. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Probably the single biggest development I'd say in DC Comics in the last 10 or 15 years, if not ever. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.